The fringe market smelled like ozone and boiled sugar, all neon glare and rain-slick tarps, the kind of place where a man could buy a replacement coil for a jump drive, and, if he wasn't careful, his conscience back. Jarrett Kellen threaded the press of bodies with his collar up and his eyes down, a soldier pretending to be a scavenger, telling himself he was here for scrap plating and nothing that breathed. Then the crowd shifted in that guilty way mobs do when they're about to enjoy something awful, and a thin girl with silver fall hair and ember-red eyes was hauled onto a crate that had learned too many names. Her tag read unsaleable, no pure bond viability, stamped in bureaucratic certainty like a curse, and the auctioneer explained, almost cheerfully, that Xyrali who couldn't link were good for parts, not for people. Sarah stared past the man as if she were memorizing his afterlife. She stood straight despite chain bite on her wrists, and when she met Jarrett's glance, it wasn't a plea, it was a dare. If you're going to look, choose a side. He didn't plan, he didn't weigh. He lifted 5 thin credits, a sum so insulting the crowd laughed, and said, clear enough to carry, sold. Silence fell the way it always does when someone breaks a rule no one wrote down. The auctioneer sputtered about minimums and handling fees until he met the calm in Jarrett's gaze that says a man has survived worse arguments. The handoff was done in a flurry of stamps that tried to turn theft into paperwork. Jarrett cut the cuffs with a compact torch and kept his palms visible the whole time, because touch without agreement is another kind of chain. Sarah didn't flinch, didn't thank him, only watched the cutter's light as if it were deciding whether to be a sunrise. Name? He asked, a simple rung on a ladder out of a hole. Seda? She said after measuring the air around the syllables, then added with a crooked smile that did not reach her eyes, and I am not a bargain. 3 men moved at the edge of the crowd with the accrued arrogance of middlemen. Jarrett turned his body so they had to meet his shoulders before his mouth, and something about the math convinced them to become spectators again. They left by a service lane that smelled like wet metal and second thoughts. On the walk to the dock, he bought 2 paper cups of broth from a vendor who didn't ask questions and placed one within her reach on a railing. When she ignored it, he didn't try to coax, only sipped his, and talked about the weather inside the asteroid belt, because neutrality can be a bridge. At Bay J6, his shuttle waited like an old dog that still wants to run. He lowered the ramp and stood aside as if holding a door in an ordinary building on an ordinary street. I paid 5 credits for time, he said, inviting the truth to stand between them. What you do with it is yours. Sarah studied the terminal's lit edge. The bulkhead scuffs, the neatly stowed tools. All the quiet evidence of a man who prefers order to theater. And then she walked aboard without asking what he wanted in exchange. Jarrett raised the ramp, set the clamps to slough off the market's gravity, and told himself he would find that scrap plating somewhere honest tomorrow. The first hours aboard the Kestrel were a negotiation conducted without declarative sentences. Jarrett gave a tour that was mostly a list of safeties: galley on the port, med kit behind the green panel, emergency latches painted yellow because he hates surprises, and Sarah listened with the half-turned head of a creature measuring distance to exits. When he asked where she wanted to sleep, she chose the engine bay without apology, tucking herself in under the hum of the fusion core the way street cats pick the warmest stone. He pretended to find that reasonable and mounted a blanket to the bulkhead so she could face the room without exposing her spine. He brewed tea, because doing something simple well can reset the shape of a day, poured 2 cups, and slid one across a workbench without watching it arrive. Minutes later, the cup had moved 3 centimeters closer to her, and steam no longer rose. You're not afraid of me, she said at last. Not a question, a diagnosis offered to a colleague. You're handling enough for both of us, he answered, and turned a slow wrench on a casing that didn't need turning. By morning, the ship felt different, as if it had accepted a new mass into its sums. Jarrett went looking for the vibration he'd been ignoring in the starboard stabilizer and found the cowling already unbolted. The crystalline bushings set out on a cloth in the order he would have chosen if he'd had an extra year of patience, and a hair-thin crack in the thrust collar illuminated by a palm lamp. Sarah knelt in the narrow space, hair tied back with a strip of foil wrap, hands steady in a way that has nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with competence. "Induction collars misaligned," she said without turning, then added, almost shyly, "Your tools are clean." Jarek passed her the 8mm driver before she asked and watched the small smile she tried to refuse. Ships listen when people earn each other's timing. When the stabilizer spun back up, the hum settled into the note he had forgotten he missed. The conversation about peer bonding arrived sideways, while they ate noodles standing up because chairs sometimes make rooms feel like offices. "Cyrali are raised to tether," Sarah said, untangling a pair of chopsticks as if they were an argument. "Skin-to-skin arc that lets nervous systems handshake. Some of us don't light. The tests call us feral." Jarek swallowed, felt an old anger stretch its legs, and chose to be careful with it. "Tests are hammers," he said gently. "They think everything useful is a nail." She glanced at him over the rim of the bowl, not softened, not convinced, just taking a picture of the sentence to develop later. "I don't stay where leashes are assumed," she warned. "No one stays where leashes are tolerated," he answered, and let the silence land like a rug instead of a trapdoor. On the third day, a patrol cutter nosed into their lane, broadcast a nailed-on cordial hail, and requested a boarding for routine compliance. Jarek's pulse ticked once, twice, then rounded out. He slotted the Kestrel onto a slow spin, locked down anything that could rattle, and met the officers in the forward bay with his hands visible and his temper on a leash of its own. The junior inspector's gaze snagged on Sarah's eyes the way untrained fingers catch on wire. He made the face that says he has read memos about her kind and believes the memos love him. "Shirali defective," he announced, the way a man might say counterfeit currency. "No peer bond signature recorded." Jarek stood between the two of them and discovered his voice could be very calm indeed. "I paid 5 credits for a person," he said, "and that transaction is complete." The senior officer, older, tireder, with the look of someone who has lost arguments he had thought were math, studied the clean wiring, the orderly lockers, the way Sarah's hands hovered near tools rather than throats, and decided to be late to his next meeting. "We have what we need," he said, and steered his junior back down the ramp before dignity could become a second casualty. When the bay sealed, Jarek let out the breath he had put away for later and leaned his forehead against the cool curve of the bulkhead, because metal does not misinterpret that sort of thing. Sarah didn't thank him. She set the inspection chit on the bench and tapped it with one fingernail, as if testing glass. "They will keep naming me as if it makes me theirs," she said. "Then we'll keep renaming the room," he replied, and went to make more tea, because there are victories you celebrate with quiet on purpose. That night, the Kestrel purred like a cat that had finally claimed a lap. Sarah curled where the engine's warmth pooled, not quite asleep, not quite standing guard. Jarek sat with a notebook and listed the replacement parts they could afford once he admitted they were staying together at least long enough to need them. He wrote, "New gasket," and "filter mesh," and, after a hesitation that felt like a cliff with a good view, "mugs with handles that don't burn your fingers." The ship's AI, which had learned to mind its own business by upsetting no one ever, dimmed the lights a fraction without being asked. Somewhere outside, the lane traffic traced routines older than both of them, indifferent and therefore merciful. Inside, 2 strangers practiced the small, stubborn arithmetic of trust. The notice went out at third dock. Random compliance sweep, present manifests, submit biologicals. Jarek disliked the word submit on principle, but he parked the Kestrel with the patience of a man who has learned that timing wins more fights than bravado. 2 officers came aboard, one gray at the temples with a stare like a ledger, the other young and too proud of his badge, and their scan paused on Sarah, the way a hook pauses on flesh. "Sirali, non-bonding phenotype," the junior announced, already enjoying the shape of his next sentence. Jarek's answer arrived in the tone he used for dangerous machinery. "Engineer, contracted, under my protection," and he stepped half a pace left, so the boy had to address a chest before he could insult a person. The older officer looked past Jarek at the engine room, took in the aligned tools, the clean cable runs, the blanket bolted to the bulkhead like an oath, and closed his tablet with a sigh that sounded like policy, remembering it was written by people. After they left, Sarah set the inspection chit on the bench and tapped it with a fingernail until it stopped feeling like a verdict. "They call us broken because their tests ask the wrong question," she said without looking up. Jarek rinsed 2 mugs, set one within her reach, and let the steam argue on his behalf. "Terrans don't have peer bond," he said. "We have choices we make so often they turn into reflexes." She rolled that around like a bolt between finger and thumb. "If I'm not an instinct, what am I?" He shrugged. "A partner, if you want the job." She tested him the way burned hands test water. When he reached for a dropped wrench, she watched to see if his grip tightened on objects when frightened. It didn't. When the galley light failed, she timed how long he stood in the dark before speaking. He said her name first, then the problem, then the solution. In that order, every time. He rebuilt the port stabilizer with her, but only after asking if she liked working in pairs. She didn't answer. Just handed him the driver while keeping the better angle for herself. At night, she slept under the engine where hum and heat made a soft wall. He ran a heat trace along the deck so the warmth would follow her even when the reactor throttled low. The first time she woke from a dream with her hands clenched, he didn't ask for the story. He offered a rag, and when she wiped the grease that wasn't there, he pretended not to see. On Halcyon's mists, they needed papers that would survive an argument, which meant visiting a registry window no one liked. The clerk, failing to hide her curiosity, lingered on Sayre's file and muttered the word defective in the tone bureaucrats reserve for mildew. Jarek slid across a maintenance log filled with tidy signatures and a list of hyperlane repairs that would make any station chief tear up from gratitude. "Bill the Kestrel," he said. "If the stamp doesn't clear, you can repossess our good deeds." The clerk smirked despite herself and printed 2 work visas that could pass for the real thing because, annoyingly, they were. Outside, Sarah bumped his shoulder with hers. Accidentally, if anyone asked, and said 5 credits is a small fee for so many forms. He answered, "I overpaid," and for the first time she smiled without flinching from what came after. The test that wasn't a test arrived as a rumor with a badge. A bioanalytics tech at Spoke 7 offering evaluation and accommodation for non-bonded Zyrali. Accommodation turned out to be a clinic with locks on the inside and a cheerful brochure about voluntary contribution to species data. Jarek read the intake waiver, let his temper cool to a usable temperature, and handed it back with his name written in the line marked Council. "Any procedure requires my sign-off," he said mildly, and when the tech tried to laugh him off, the dockmaster, who owed Jarek 3 favors and knew his ledger, leaned in through the door and said, "The station liked the Kestrel's habit of paying in repairs." Sarah watched the room choose to be civilized because 2 people had decided not to be outnumbered. On the way back to the ship, she asked if all Terran law worked like that. "No," he said, "but enough of it does when you refuse to move." That evening, under a maintenance lamp, Sarah produced a narrow strip of burnished steel and a coil of copper wire. "Hold still," she said, threading the metal into a loop and twisting the wire until it made a small hinged clasp. She clicked it around his wrist and tightened it to skin. "Payment schedule," she added when he cocked an eyebrow. "For 5 credits," he said. "For not making me an experiment," she corrected. He didn't say thank you. He set the teapot back on because some alters prefer boiling water to speeches. 2 jumps later, the Kestrel fell into step with an escort convoy threading the verge of the Decaris belt, and Jarek's shoulders made the minute adjustments pilots make when they pretend not to be worried. Sarah noticed. "You fly by listening," she said. He nodded toward the viewport, where satellites winked like reluctant beacons. "And by counting who's in front of us and who's behind." She fingered the copper clasp she'd made him. "Then count me where it matters," she said. "When the numbers go bad, I'm not cargo." He counted again, and the sum changed in all the right places. The ambush unfolded like paperwork. Polite ping, request to throttle, an identification code that looked official until you held it up to the light. Jarek said no 3 different ways: legal, friendly, bored, and when the fake patrol slid sideways to block the lane, the slaver transponders bled through the paint. 2 cutters bracketed the convoy. A 3rd tucked in behind the Kestrel like a knife meant to be a lesson. Jarek dropped power, kicked the tail, and let the ship's profile smear. The cutters lunged, discovered empty space, and had to explain themselves to momentum. Sarah was already out of her harness, boots planting in the quick rhythm of someone whose body remembers corridors. She tore the panel off the dorsal locker, yanked a coil of filament line and a harpoon launcher older than her anger, and popped the service hatch before the ship had finished pretending to be a rock. The first boarders cut through the port hatch with more enthusiasm than plan, the deck filled with smoke that tasted like burned plastic and certainty. Jarek met the first man with a short baton and a longer refusal, let the second run into the bulkhead he thought was an exit, and put his shoulder into the door as it tried to decide what side it was on. Sarah's scream built from somewhere older than language and crashed through the corridor like a pressure wave. She hit the third boarder low, took his knee from him with her hip, and threw the coil around his ankles in a figure eight that would make a sailor weep with pride. The fourth tried to be a hero with a shock pike. She caught the shaft, twisted once, and taught him what it felt like when a tool becomes an argument you've already lost. "Clear," Jarek said, and she answered, "Not yet." Because the cutter's clamps still slurped power from their hull, and the real fight was above their heads. They climbed into wind and noise. Decaris threw light off the belt's fractured ice like 1,000 little knives. The Kestrel bucked as the cutter tugged with a magnet that would have peeled paint off a planet. Jarek crawled onto the spine in a skin suit, clipped in, and hauled himself hand over hand toward the clamp. The universe under him was a long blue shrug. "Do not look down," Sarah said from the hatch, which made him laugh because he already had. And then she was out there with him, the harpoon gun balanced in the crook of her arm like a forgotten instrument. "Aim for the collar," he said. "Break the throat and the jaw can't bite." She fired once, twice, and the third bolt went home with a sound that made his teeth ring. The clamp spasmed, released, and the cutter yawed away with the offended dignity of a predator, told it had misread the menu. The reprieve lasted a breath. The second cutter came in hot, spinning to throw boarders like seeds. Jarek shoved Sarah flat, and the grapnels sang over their heads, scratching arcs into the hull. He felt the sting at his ribs where one barb had kissed too close, tasted copper, and breathed once to file the pain where it wouldn't disrupt the rest of him. Sarah didn't ask permission. She rose into the slipstream like a curse, and leapt the gap, boots thudding into the cutter's plating with a magnetic clack. She moved like sabotage had been her first language. Drive a spike, pull a panel, rip the right cable, and leave the wrong one humming, until the cutter coughed smoke and began to list. Jarek tracked her with the rifle he hated, and saved for times like this, keeping the space around her quiet by removing anything loud. When she came back, she was vibrating with a voltage that had nothing to do with electricity. Her hands shook. Her pupils were too wide. Her jaw had the hinge-locked look of a person bracing for the worst reaction. Jarek grounded his rifle, lifted both palms, and stepped inside the storm's wind. "Look at me," he said. Not command, invitation. She did, and the breath she had been holding since someone first wrote unsaleable next to her name left her like a tide. "I will not be gentle with them," she warned. "You never have to be gentle with someone else's chains," he said. He touched her face as if testing a weld, checking for heat, checking for cracks, and when his hands didn't flinch, she let her forehead rest against his. Zyrali trust sign, Terran relief translated into the same shape. The convoy made it through on the back of that quiet. Jarek sat the Kestrel back in her lane as if nothing had happened, and keyed open a channel long enough to tell the cutter's paymaster that experiments were expensive and failure more so. Sarah tore the unsaleable tag into strips and fed them into the galley burner, piece by bureaucratic piece, until the letters became smoke, and the smoke remembered it could be nothing at all. Later, patched and breathing, they drifted under the slow turn of a cold star and watched the belt flicker like a laugh that took its time. "I don't peer bond," she said into the light, as if filing a report at last. "I know," he answered. "We chose anyway." She nodded and, after a thoughtful silence, added, "Next time, I jump first." He grinned. "We'll argue about it on the way." They chose a place that made no promises. Ring 12, a rusted service platform drifting in the blue shadow of an abandoned moon where the handrails were a suggestion, and the stars crowded close enough to eavesdrop. Jarek brought a portable welder and the bent strip of stamped steel that had once branded Sarah unsaleable, and he hammered it flat on a cargo plate until the letters forgot their job. He braided a thread of copper from her wrist clasp through the metal, made a seam, made a circle, and cooled it in tea because water was in short supply and sentiment was cheap to carry. Their witness was a retired dockmaster who swore marriages on the same clipboard he used to clear traffic, and the Kestrel's AI, who promised not to record anything except the time the lights dimmed and the way the hull shuddered when the station's old gyros hiccuped. Sarah wore a pilot's jacket with the sleeves rolled and her hair tied back with foil, the way she did when work mattered. She pressed her forehead to Jarek's chest in the Zyrali sign for deepest trust, and he let his heartbeat answer without reaching for a sensor to verify it. He read his vows off the margin of a coolant schematic because paper you've actually used knows what to do with weight. He promised not to turn her into a project, to keep his hands visible when the world demanded they be hidden, to make tea before speeches, to be a hinge and never a lock. Sarah spoke in her first language to promise that no test would ever audit what they kept, that laughter would be their second engine, and that if fear returned with papers and polite voices, she would break both without apology. When she slid the welded ring onto his finger, the station lights flickered and came back up as if an old grid had decided to believe in something again. The interruption arrived with a familiar stench of authority. A small shuttle in patrol colors, a magistrate's seal projected like a halo, a broadcast warrant stuffed with verbs that tried to make observe mean own. Jarek didn't stop the ceremony. He nodded once to the dockmaster, who took 2 steps to the right and unplugged a relay with the bored grace of a man who understands both jurisdiction and electricity, and the warrant shrank to a confused square of static. The patrol tried it the hard way. 2 armored officers clattering down the gangway with a confidence that came from never having been told no by anyone who could make it stick, and met Sarah halfway across the deck. She didn't draw a weapon. She showed them her empty hands and said, "You are late," with such ferocious calm that one of them forgot his script and looked behind him to see what he'd missed. Jarek didn't raise his voice or his fist. He teed 3 maintenance drones into a holding pattern that happened to be between the officers and the couple, and when the younger man swore and reached for a taser, the nearest drone reclassified the gesture as unsafe to structure and made a tidy case for immediate retreat. The magistrate, who could read a room when the room was winning, signed his own recall and left with what dignity can be scraped off galvanized steel. They kept their place in the vows as if interruption had been written into the liturgy. The dockmaster declared them married in the same tone he used to declare a lane clear. Jarek kissed Sarah slowly, like someone laying a gasket he intends to trust under pressure, and the Kestrel hooted a celebratory tone it insisted was a calibration test. Friends they hadn't noticed collecting at the rail, scrappers with hands like maps, vendors who sold soup without water, a child in a coat 3 sizes too large, clapped by degrees until the ring had more noise than rust. Jarek paid the dockmaster with the only coin he'd kept from the market, a thin, scuffed 5-credit disc, then bolted it to the Kestrel's bulkhead at eye level, where new hires would have to ask the story. Sarah cut her old tag into 5 neat shards and set them in a small tin with the copper scraps, an altar made of refusals. When they finally undocked, the platform receded like a decision you don't take back, and the ring on Jarek's hand warmed to the temperature of work. Years have a way of growing roots when you water them, and theirs took in a glass-roofed orchard on a shale-boned asteroid where wildflowers learned to tolerate engine noise. The Kestrel docked there more often than not, engines ticking down while small feet thudded through the gangway. Lio with Jarek's laugh and Sarah's stare that sorted lies from mistakes, and Omri who climbed like a mechanic born in partial gravity and asked questions as if the universe were a patient mechanism. Pier bond readings still flat, the old monitors would have said had anyone been rude enough to bring them. Instead, Mornings measured trust by who reached for which wrench, and evenings by who remembered to turn the kettle off. Jarek taught torque and the sacrament of clean tools. Built model ships from scrap with curves that made aerodynamics feel like kindness, and put his calloused thumb under tiny chins to aim gazes toward stars that would not always behave. Sarah taught them how to step into a room without asking the room's permission, to read body language like a second alphabet, to say stop like a switch and again like a bridge. And she made the orchard's air smell like citrus and solvent and bread. Trouble tried to reassert its title with a doctor's coat and a symposium invite. The council's science directorate sent a courier with careful eyes and gentler grammar, requesting a longitudinal study of cross-species outcomes in non-bonded Zerali families, which sounded civil until you placed it next to history. Jarek met the man in the hangar with a clipboard that listed maintenance performed for half the belt, names and dates and things that kept other people alive, and he offered to trade data for a promise. The directorate would guarantee no child in their jurisdiction could be collared for any reason, and the guarantee would be enforced by fines large enough to change behavior rather than headlines. The courier blinked the way people do when a counteroffer edges into ethics. He left with a jar of orchard jam and a draft statute he would have to read several times before deciding whether to be a better person or a worse bureaucrat. Sarah watched from the mezzanine, one hand resting on the rail, not pretending the fear was gone, but letting it be smaller than the railing. The slavers came only once, and it was the kind of mistake that makes careers end in paperwork. They rode a false beacon into the lane at dusk, painted themselves in the colors of rescue, and announced a child welfare inspection with the plastic confidence of men who believe courtesy is armor. Jarek saw them on the scope and put the kestrel between the cutters and the colony. He told Lio and Amri to the crawlspace drill they hated and loved, and in the same breath asked Sarah to close the orchard's west windows, because glass prefers not to learn ballistics. The cutters tried to box the docking ring. Jarek cut power to the outer rails so their clamps had nothing to bite. Borders and polished boots met the floor at the wrong angle and the wrong speed. Sarah met them at the threshold with a voice that turned their tailored scripts to ash. He didn't have to shout. He didn't have to show them the baton they had taught him to use. He pointed to the 5-credit coin on the bulkhead and, in the long 10 seconds before they decided to leave, let them do the math. After, he sat the children on the kestrel's nose where the hull held the day's residual heat, and he told them the story of the market again, because some myths must remain instruction manuals. 5 credits, Lio said every time, scandalized. Highway robbery, Jarek agreed solemnly, and Sarah corrected them both by pointing out that the auctioneer had underpriced the universe's patience and overestimated its forgiveness. Omri wanted to know if Pier Bond was real and if they were broken for not lighting up a machine. Sarah said machines were shy around people who had better work to do and pulled them both into the silent Zyrali trust press of foreheads to chest and let their hearts count together until even the idea of a meter got bored. Later, after bedtime negotiations and the treaty of an extra page at story time, Jarek found Sarah under the orchard dome with a wrench in her hand and the stars on her face, and he stood a moment to memorize how a person looks when they have made a room safe by occupying it fully. When the directorate finally sent word back, it arrived as a law with teeth. No collars, no clinics without consent, no voluntary studies implied by ration lines, penalties indexed to the budget of the offender plus interest. Jarek taped a copy to the mess wall opposite the scoreboard where the kids' track doors opened and apologies issued. And he let himself laugh when he saw Leo add a tolly under the second column after shoving his sister off a ladder and then building her a better one. The orchard bloomed on cycles that did not care about headlines. The kestrel kept a little rust out of pure nostalgia. The 5-credit coin polished itself under 1,000 idle thumbs until it gleamed like a moral. On the day Omri asked to take the pilot's chair for a spin around the belt, Jarek stood behind her with empty hands and full lungs, and Sarah leaned against the bulkhead, smiling like someone who had chosen correctly a long time ago and remembered to renew the choice without anyone sending a reminder. At night, when the station dimmed to the safety glow and the orchard sang its soft green hush, Jarek would catch his reflection in the viewport. The same scar on his jaw, the same tired eyes. And then he'd see Sarah's shadow come up beside his, and the small, darting silhouettes of children who thought gravity was optional and fear negotiable. "No bond," she'd tease, pressing her forehead to his chest in a gesture that never needed witnesses, and he'd answer, "Plenty of bond, just not for sale." The kestrel purred, the coin shone, the law held. The kids dreamed loudly, and the world that had tried to price her at 5 credits kept making change for the future they'd bought with it.